Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second of this year's Presidential Dialogue Series. And I'm absolutely thrilled tonight that my guest is DeRionne Tanden, the President and CEO of the Center for American Progress. Like many of you, I am fangirling up here because I know several of you, as you came in tonight, were saying similar things to me. So I have an unusual set of nerves this evening for this conversation. You will hear more about her in just a moment when we offer a formal introduction as to why we invited her here. But I thought it would be important for me to set a context for this dialogue series. We've been talking this year about the politics of radical inclusion. As I've said before, radical inclusion is not just a concept. For us at Montgomery College, it is indeed an intentional practice. It's a practice of asking ourselves consistently and intentionally, is everyone included in the gathering? Is this conversation including everyone? Is this policy including everyone? Are we giving privilege to the lived experiences of all of our students and employees? Such questions are inherently political because whomever decides to answer those questions are indeed the gatekeepers in our society. One of the things that I admire most about the Center for American Progress is that it is rigorous about helping us hold ourselves accountable to answering those types of questions. It asks some profoundly ethical questions about the politics of poverty and healthcare and housing that underscore what radical inclusion is all about. In the same way that we do here at Montgomery College, it answers the question of who deserves to be included when we talk about education or employment or justice. And that, to me, my friends, is really at the heart of what we mean when we talk about radical inclusion. And that answer is everyone. Everyone should be included. Now, I'm going to turn this over right now to Dr. Sanjay Rai, our Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, who will introduce our guest this evening. Dr. Rai?
Thank you, Dr. Pollard. I'd like to extend my welcome to all of you. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I want to recognize Senator Cheryl Kagan for Maryland General Assembly. And we want to thank her not for her support to the college only, but especially her support to Presidential Dialogue Series and especially sponsoring the event tonight. Thank you very much. Neera Tanden is President and CEO of the Center for American Progress, the largest progressive think tank in the United States. Before joining CAP, she worked as a key member of the health reform team of former President Barack Obama, where she helped to develop and pass the Affordable Care Act. She also managed all domestic policy initiatives during Obama's first presidential campaign and has served as several leadership roles for former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Ms. Tanden has written extensively on policy issues for publications such as New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and The New Republic. She appears regularly on television as a political commentator. In fact, I just saw her on Hardball last night. At CAP, Ms. Tanden is focused on building an inclusive agenda that expands opportunity for all Americans. The center's effort to improve the affordability of post-secondary education, as well as increase access to high-quality K-12 and child care, embodies its commitment to creating inclusive opportunity. CAP also engages in open and public dialogues on progressive issues concerning race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, and their implications for achieving greater equity and social justice across our society. Montgomery College is very pleased to have such a progressive, inclusive thinker joining us tonight. Thank you.
So we are absolutely delighted. Thank you, Sanjay, for providing that more formal introduction, because I needed to settle down a little bit because this is going to be a riveting conversation. I know those of you who've not been to one of these before, although I see several familiar faces, we typically go an hour with a dialogue between me and the guest speaker, where I have an abundance of questions that I'm always prepared to ask. This evening we're going to do a little bit unique difference, because Neera has a flight. She has a red eye tonight that she has to be on. So we're going to do a hard stop at 8:15. Hard stop at 8:15 to allow her to get to where she needs to go. With that in mind, I'm going to pull back my questions just a little bit. We talk for maybe about 45 minutes, give or take, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So feel free. There are microphones positioned within the room. When we say open up, get there. Otherwise, I have no problem going back to my questions at hand. Okay. So we know that the issues that CAP has worked on impact all of us on a daily basis. Obviously, education, immigration, poverty, voting rights, and healthcare, among others. And many of these issues, I think, that the Center advocates for have taken an abrupt U-turn post the 2016 presidential election.
I think that's very fair.
Thank you, thank you. But I know then that you have been very busy. As many of our guests who've come in this night have commented, they've read your materials, they've certainly seen you talking about this. The Center has spent about 15 years designing policy solutions for some of our most fundamental issues addressing us. To that end, I have several groups of questions that I'd like to pose, and the first one really speaks to this issue of leadership. I'm particularly interested in, before we move into our current state of leadership, having worked for President Obama, having worked for Secretary Clinton, I'd love to hear your reflections about leadership. What were some of the most exciting things that you did in that space, and what did you learn about leadership from those folks that you worked with?
Yeah, I mean, I feel very privileged. First, let me say I'm really grateful to be invited to this and to be part of a presidential dialogue. I would say, I think in this moment in our time, the kind of questions we're wrestling with as a country are as profound as we have ever wrestled with, and I really believe that the way we're going to solve the problems we have in front of us are through ideas like radical inclusion, ensuring that we're listening to, hearing from pretty much everyone at the table, and so I really applaud the dialogue and the effort by the college to really tackle some of these issues in a way that I think is really the only path forward. So I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful for your leadership, and thank you so much for that very kind introduction. So I think we live in such cynical times, and it's hard not to be cynical when you have the current administration, and I'll try not to be too political about it, but I'll say, I mean, I've been very privileged to have worked for two presidents and one former First Lady and Secretary of State. I started pretty soon after law school. I started working in the White House for then First Lady Hillary Clinton, but I was on the Domestic Policy Council for Bill Clinton. I worked for Hillary when she was a senator, and then I worked for President Obama on healthcare reform. And I think our politics and our communications and our culture really focus so much on the cynical, but what I was really privileged to see working for those three people who are very different people, that in the policy debates, we think about presidents and campaigning and rallying, but there are people who actually are president who spend some time on policy issues and not tweeting.
Pull back.
I know, I'll dial it back, I will. But, and wrestling, I worked for President Obama during healthcare reform, which was obviously very tough debate, a very long and very tough debate. I worked for Hillary Clinton for many years on a series of issues. I worked for President Clinton, and they were very cynical. I mean, my experience working for those three politicians and political leaders was on policy issues, and they can be the most profound, like how do we deliver healthcare for millions more people, or smaller issues like after school or Head Start. All three of those people, and it sounds incredibly Pollyannish, but all three of those people were really motivated by how to help the most people with the political capital they had at the time. And I really think like so many people watch House of Cards, or sort of see the political back and forth. And I go on TV, and it can be like some form of grudge match. But truly great political leaders are thinking through how to solve people's problems. And all three of those people were motivated in large measure by, really how to help people, and saw public service as their vehicle by which to do that. And there are lots of parts of public service that are ugly. There are lots of parts that are ego-driven, and actually, sort of help build one's ego. But at the end of the day, I think the greatest public servants, and I feel privileged to have worked with some of them, are people who are literally trying to look at the world and make it better, and see politics, which seems crazy, but see politics as the way to help the most people. I was really struck by when working for President Obama. There are lots of tough fights on healthcare, but there's lots of it that's just a giant headache nightmare, right? Like negotiating with senators who keep telling you they're going to vote for you and they never do. Or don't in the end. But I really think that President Obama was motivated by, I think he came to politics because he saw, and he was a community activist, and you can do more for more people through politics. And so I think leadership at its core is and should be about what you can do for other people. Service is about what you can do for other people, and public service is just the means by which you can do that.
Wow. So we know then that this most recent election, we saw some very dramatic turns in the midterm elections that I thought that I'd like to talk with you a little bit about, particularly around women in leadership. In 2018, 125 women were elected to the U.S. Congress. 43 of them were women of color, and at least 3 women identify as LGBTQ. I was particularly moved by watching, while unsuccessful, the campaign of Stacey Abrams, looking at obviously our new House of Representatives in a lot of ways that mirrors America in ways that we have not seen in quite some time. Yet we know that right now women only represent about 24% of the total Congress. Why do you think that is such, and do you see that changing? Because I am always struck by that the small, if you think of most Americans, or half of us are women. Yeah. Why are we not seeing more women step into those leadership roles or be elected into them?
Yeah, so I think this is a cause for a great deal of optimism in this moment. So you noted the figures. There's so many more women coming to Congress. It was really interesting in the primary. What was really interesting over the last year and a half is how many women are stepping up. Emily's list fielded 11,000 women wanting to run for some office. That's not necessarily Congress or Senate. That could be state legislature or city council or mayor. Or even school board, which is really important for people to run for school board. There's always like a first critical step. And in previous cycle, that number was 600, 900, or 1,000. So we saw a massive, massive surge. And interestingly, in 2/3 of the races on the Democratic side, of the 2/3 of the primaries, where a single woman was running amongst, often many men, the woman won, which is very unusual. So, I started my political career, it's almost depressing to say this, 20 years ago, and I feel very fortunate that I started working for Bill and Hillary Clinton, and I worked basically for Hillary Clinton in the White House in the late 1990s, and in the early 90s, there was a first year of the woman. 1992 was actually in a similar moment. It was after the Anita Hill Sort of what I would say debacle with the Clarence Thomas hearings. A whole group of women surged into that election. But even then, you never saw anything like the numbers we've seen in 2018. And I have a personal theory, which is I think a lot of women, and we saw this in individual interviews with women running for Congress, but I think a lot of women, looked at the 2016 election and were really shocked. I mean, I think if you sort of step back from it, a lot of women thought Hillary was going to win. A lot of women thought that after, what happened with the Access Hollywood videotape, the whole election was over. And I think a lot of women woke up after the election and thought, there is something crazy about a country that would just had this election, and really saw it as a, kind of assault on their own dignity, that level of problem didn't take down a candidate. And so I think, I've met a lot of these women, and what's really exciting about a lot of the people who run, men and women, is that they're people who've had some kind of service to the country. It's just not been political service. So Abigail Spanberger ran in Virginia, and she used to work in foreign policy and the Foreign Service and the Senate, and actually the CIA, and has never actually held elected office, but ran the first time. Alyssa Slotkin, who ran in Michigan, was at the State Department and hasn't, she's never run for office before, but has served her country. Connor Lamb was an Iraq veteran and a prosecutor. Again, he's never been for elected office, but served his country. My favorite candidate, because she used to work for me, Haley Stevens, worked on the auto bailout or auto task force for President Obama, that went back to Michigan, ran, and just won. And she's one of the youngest members of Congress. And so it's really exciting. I mean, we live in very cynical times, and I'm not here to be Pollyannish about the challenges we face, but was really, I think, invigorating about this election was just how so many people stepped up. Candidates stepped up to run when having never run before. Volunteers flooded these races. I mean, the resistance in the country really flooded congressional races. And it was a lot of women who were volunteering for these races. And then really small donors. So we saw for the first time, these first-time candidates had 2-to-1, 3-to-1. They were outraising Republican incumbents by so much money on the basis of small donors, all small donors making contributions, no PACs, no corporate PACs. So I actually, I really think that in a sense, I'm hopeful that this election was the beginning of a kind of renewal of our democracy, and people are really seeing the stakes and why it's so important. And we had the highest level of turnout in the midterm that we've had in close to 100 years. We just studied it today. We had 49% of the country vote in a midterm, and the last time it approached that for a midterm was 1918 or something like that. So some kind of crazy number. So I think, again, not here to dispel all the cynicism in America, and it's hard not to be cynical, particularly when you wake up and read tweets. But I do think that there's a lot of cause for optimism.
I want to receive that too, because it's interesting. The context in which I asked the question was almost somewhat punitive in that we only have this number of women, but I am going to hear that way. This idea that this is a momentum. There is an opportunity that this has sparked something that we hopefully will see continue to grow within the country.
Yeah, and just to actually better answer your question, I think things are changing. So what I mean why I think it's so important that all these candidates are able to raise money from small donors. One of the hindrances for women running has been they're concerned that they can't raise money like men can, or the network that men have established, or et cetera. And so the fact that you had all these women come in, first-time candidates, be able to raise so much money from small donors around the country just wanting to kind of change our politics means, oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh my God, you're so kind.
Thank you.
I feel so special tonight. I think that's clearing a hurdle for women in the future, and the fact that you can, hopefully this will be a momentum building experience. People will see women are winning in a sense at a almost parity rate or higher, at least on one side. So more and more women, I hope, will run.
Thank you. I'm going to take that put that in my gratitude journal tonight, because I think that it's an important point. It's about how you choose to see the moment. So I think, as you point out, cynicism, a certain amount of negativity seems to be pervasive, but this idea of seeing this as a momentum point, I think, is really important. Obviously, we're in an educational space, so asking questions about education are particularly important to me. And the work that CAP has done most recently around in the space, you had a terrific report on your website called Beyond Tuition.
Yeah.
And that report, I thought, laid out how our nation needs to envision the role of higher education in creating equity. Something that we talk a lot about here at Montgomery College. Fundamentally, the report articulates that post-secondary education is a civil right.
Yeah.
It should be viewed as one. Could you talk about what this means and why that's so important?
Yeah, I think. So I'll start really broadly and zero in on our recommendations, but I think in the United States today, the lever that we know of to create upward mobility is education, and particularly in the economy as it's transformed over the last several decades, is higher education. And so, we've sort of have the world upside down, right? So President Clinton, we used to say, what you earn depends on what you learn. And we live in an economy where your knowledge, your human capital, is so determinative of what you can do economically. And yet, over several decades, we've made access to higher education more of a privilege, right, than a right. And what's odd about that is, if you really look at it globally, we are out of the mainstream of the systems of democracy. So most countries, most of our competitors, make higher education free or virtually free, because they look at a world that's super competitive, where you need to have people with a higher education, a graduate degree, in order to compete in the global economy. And so they look at they have a kind of human capital approach, and they make it free or virtually free. In fact, China is dramatically investing in higher education. And so, if you actually believe, and I think one of the reasons why I think this presidential dialogue is so important, if you really truly believe in inclusion and you believe in an inclusive economy, we should at the very least make it so that access to higher education isn't a privilege of an elite few. And we have a kind of patchwork system. There's loans and there's loans and some grants, et cetera. But for so many Americans, particularly low-income Americans, working-class Americans, higher education remains an elusive dream for them. And that, the point we make is that is not a problem just for that individual or that family or that neighborhood. Fundamentally, that's a problem for all of us. Yes. And that's why, states that are investing in higher education, I was very lucky. I went to UCLA. I went through the University of California system, which is California in the 60s made a huge investment in higher education, and it has had it is one of the reasons why California is the economic success it is. But that takes leaders thinking 10, 20, 30 years down the road, and there's not a lot of incentive structure for that. And so we really believe that you can't make this just an issue state by state. You need to the federal government needs to invest in making sure higher education is something that is truly available to all Americans.
Well, you're talking my kind of talk, because I think one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about here is this idea that if we really want to see a mobile, economically mobile community, which we all need, it is dependent upon us having a well-educated community. And the access point for so many Americans in this country is community colleges. Roughly half of undergraduates in this country start their education at a community college. So if we think about that, one of the things that I found particularly alluring about your report was also this recognition of who today's American college students are. They are not oftentimes going to be the ones we think of who are 18, graduating, first-time graduates from high school, graduate in May or June, start at their university, go to the residence hall or the fraternity or sorority, and they're there for 4 years in the residence halls or wherever, and they graduate and so forth. That's not the typical college student, and you all spent a good amount of time talking about that. What I'm interested in, what motivated or encouraged you all to understand the complexity of this student? Because it's amazing to me that when you look at the dialogue that's happening oftentimes in this country around higher education, they completely forget the majority of students who are, our average student age is about 27 and 28. They are working parents, they are caregivers for aging adults, they are working 2, 3, 4 jobs, they're new to this country. So there's all types of things that come with that don't fit this paradigm of what one thinks about. Could you talk a little bit about how you all arrived at this work?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the good things about being at a think tank is that you get to think, but you also, we do deal with data, and everything you say is true. And I think one thing that we should recognize about the community college system, which is so vital in our economy, is that community colleges is also essentially the vehicle by which we do lifetime learning, right? So, what's weird about the kind of economic system that we have today is we live in a world where people move jobs, multiple jobs in a career. It used to be, you have the same job or, a similar job a decade, another decade, and another decade. But obviously today, in today's economy, people change jobs much more quickly, and they need to skill up for different jobs. And so employers are actually pulling back from that. And what's really important is that we actually invest more in skills development for people so that they can make those transitions easier. In the United States, the place that we do that most is community college. So people are going back to school to get a series of skills. I mean, often they're getting a degree, but sometimes they're just going back to get a series of skills for a kind of career switch or move. And what's odd is that, as a country, we invest, not that much 0 to 5, a lot 5 to 18, 5 from ages 5 to 18, some 18 to 22, but then very little the rest of people's lives. And what we're trying to communicate to people is that in a mobile economy, if you want to get people, if you want to essentially give people opportunity for upward mobility, and I think essentially a lot of the challenges we have as a country is that people just don't feel like upward mobility exists for them or their children. And if you want to actually address that problem, you have to invest, and we have to invest in community colleges. I think the reason why the paradigm is up, just to be clear, is a lot of elites send their relatively privileged kids to 4-year community, traditional elite schools, and often lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of people's experiences are actually, higher education experiences are at public institutions of some kind. State universities are much more prevalent than private institutions. Community college is much more prevalent than anywhere else, than any other institution, and they kind of lose sight of that. And it's really important that we recognize the importance of that, and that's why I think it's really important that you have, state leaders who do that. But a deep inequity in our system is if what you learn is entirely dependent on what state you happen to be in, you're just going to exacerbate massive inequalities, right? So I mean, people in Maryland are more fortunate because Maryland invests more than, say, Mississippi. But that's, you get that actually exacerbates inequality because people who really need it are people in states that aren't making the investments. California, New York, coastal states are making real investments over the long term. And you see the cycle where a lot of states aren't making those investments, and then there's declining opportunity, and then people leave, and then the people who stay behind are angry that people have left, and you sort of see the cycle of divisive politics.
What begets what begets.
Yeah.
That's very intriguing. One of the passages from the report Beyond Tuition really hit me, and it struck me because of the students that we serve at Montgomery College. And it says, quote, "Too often, institutions and public policies are designed to serve the so-called traditional student, one who enters college at the age of 18, studies full-time, and has no other major responsibilities. This is increasingly a common reality is that their average student is older, attends college part-time, works longer hours, is raising a family, or does all of the above." I'm really interested, given that backdrop, one of the issues you all talk a lot about is this issue of equity and also affordability. So I want to first talk about the issue of affordability because, and I thought your commentary just then about what's happening in many states and how the investments in higher education, which may or may not be there, have produced this ecosystem where you are seeing industry leave, you're seeing families that had the idea that they could have upward mobility, it no longer exists. And at the same time, you see the cost of higher education in certain types of institutions growing, outpacing the people's ability to pay for that. What do you think would be a solution to that? And not to say I'm going to write it down and say that Neera Tanden. How do you address some of that?
We have specific. We basically call for making college much more affordable. All kinds of college much more affordable for middle class families and people struggling to get in the middle class. So, we're not arguing that you have to make college free for every single person. Obviously, there are wealthy families that can afford college, and people don't need to subsidize that. But in the world we're in today, we think that basically we should make tuition. Essentially, you don't want to make tuition and the cost of college the barrier for people to enter. And there's so much sticker shock with costs, and that there are a lot of families, a lot of low-income students who could get into top-notch schools, choose not to go because they just worry about the level of debt. So we believe there should be a federal investment and make college much more affordable. And for families that can afford it, have some skin in the game so that they're paying for parts of it, but that it's relatively subsidized. You have to create a complicated system around that, but it's we think really important. We also think that colleges have to be more, have to be accountable for those dollars. So, really ensuring that you're providing an education that makes sense for people. And then also, we believe that equity and affordability go hand in hand, right? Because essentially what's happened is that so many essentially low-income students who are disproportionately students of color just don't have access to education in the way that others do. And that sticker price affects them more. And I'll say from my own experience, my parents got divorced when I was 5. My father left. My mother ended up being on welfare for several years, and used the social safety net. So we went into low-income housing or subsidized housing, and I was on food stamps, etc. But and she several years later got a job, and many years later actually was able to afford her own house. So we went through, we really used the social safety net, and it was there for us. But I remember that same feeling of my mother thinking, like, how could we ever pay for college? And I just feel lucky that she just assumed we could, right? But for so many kids whose parents, my mother did go to college, whose parents don't go to college, it just feels like that's too far from them. And I think the challenge, I mean, one of the issues of radical inclusion, and the idea that when I think of radical inclusion, what I think of is trying to imagine what it feels like for someone who has a distant experience from you, not just someone with a similar experience. And we all lose out, truly, when someone who could be an engineer or a doctor or a prosecutor or whatever chooses can't really do that because we are making decisions as a society that it's not important enough for us that they have that opportunity.
So those of you who haven't read the report, I encourage you to read it. And there's one point I'll amplify and then move on because I thought this was really provocative going to your issue around equity and affordability. You all propose that colleges should conduct, quote, an equity audit, a top to bottom review of policies, practices, and resources in order to identify areas that might be contributing to gaps in outcomes for key groups of students based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status. And I just want to lift that up because I think that if institutions really want to do the work, if they really want to understand what those byproducts are of what they're doing, the Latin for radical is the root.
Yeah.
So you actually have to get to the root of the issue, and policy, practice, those are the things that drive the outcomes that you're really trying to affect. So I just wanted to lift that up.
Yeah, so I'll just say
provocative.
one word about that. And you know, I think I went to UCLA, I graduated in 1992, and in a big conversation topic. So when I was at UCLA, it was just becoming a majority people of color school. So during my 4 years, it went from being majority white to majority minority. And there was a lot of discussion about differential retention rates between Latino students, African American students, Asian students. And you know, it's really interesting. One of the reasons why the audit is important is there actually are a lot of things that aren't super costly that actually affect outcomes for students of color retention rates. So, I mean, a lot of these issues are really like a lot of students of color are first-time college students. Their families are struggling, and so they think, okay, if there's a particular family struggle, it's better for me to leave college than come back. Now, that's the worst advice. Actually, you should always stay in school, but it makes sense to think that. It's not irrational to think, oh, I'll just leave a quarter and come back. Lots of students never come back. So, you know, we did this stuff this is like a very long time ago that I was a student, but there was providing mentors for students.
Yep.
You know, student mentors for new incoming students, which really didn't cost very much money. UCLA looked at, and you know, we did that. It's a university. It studied that it was impactful. It did more and more of that. It moved around the UC system, and retention rates have moved up dramatically. So it's not always that you have to spend a lot of money to solve a problem. You just, you can't solve problems that you don't know about, right? So the audit is, the idea of analyzing this is just to recognize that it is important that all students are thriving in the higher education experience, because one of the real problems with higher education is that if you don't graduate and you've taken on the debt, then you're worse off than never starting. So that's why it's really, really important that we're intentional about it.
All right, so audience, I'm going to invite you all to find your way to the mics if you have questions, because if you don't, I have a whole set of questions on DACA. I
can also call in people.
Voters. I want to talk about voter suppression. I want to talk about our nation and our democracy right now. So I got a whole list of them. But I will provide you with an opportunity to make your way to a microphone here or a microphone there. And if you would read your question or say it succinctly, then we'll be able to have Neera respond to it.
Great.
Hello. Thanks a lot for making the time to join us this evening.
Thanks for
My name is Christian Bodo. You've had a very extraordinary career. You've worked closely with President Clinton, Secretary Clinton, President Obama. You are a lady leading a great organization. Looking back at such an extraordinary career, what would you, I know you are in the prime of your life, but looking back at such an extraordinary career, what would you want us to know about some of the major accomplishments you've had in your life? What would you want us to remember as some of the major accomplishments in your
Yeah.
life?
First of all, thank you. That's a very generous question. I have to say I felt very privileged to work on major pieces of legislation, and so I did spend a year of my life actually in the legislative process, and years before that in campaigns, building the argument for healthcare, and then working. And it was a great privilege to work on passing the Affordable Care Act. And I can say during doing it was kind of a nightmare, just to be honest, which is there are multiple moments where I really thought to myself, God does not want people to have health care, because what are the chances that we were going to go through and pass these bills, pass a bill out of the House and pass a bill out of the Senate, and then a Republican is going to get elected to Ted Kennedy's seat in Massachusetts. And it was in that moment that I was really, we haven't had health care. Democrats have been trying to get universal health care for 100 years. And that night that happened, I literally was like, how? I wasn't in a fetal position, but I definitely felt like I was in a fetal position, and I thought, this is bad. But I'll say this about that moment and other moments I've had, which is I have been really lucky to work for people who have walked through fire. They've been personally attacked. They've been, their motives are attacked. Their whole life is scrutinized. I worked for Bill Clinton. I worked for Hillary Clinton. I worked on healthcare during the whole birther thing, which happened to President Obama after he was elected. And people think these people have no feelings. They have feelings, and it hurts. But in those moments, each one of those people actually kept their eye on the prize of helping people. One of the oddest things of working for Hillary Clinton, who is the most scrutinized person in America, is, her instincts really were always I'm doing this to kind of help people. And she thought she was good at helping people. She didn't have I have a 50-year mission to get debt-free college or something. Her attitude every day was what can I do to help the most people? When she was a senator, when she was a first lady, she focused on issues no one would pay attention to, because she was everyone's paying attention. Why should I use the power of the first lady or the voice of the first lady to focus on issues that other people care about? I should do it for things that people can care. I remember one time we did this work on folic acid in babies. And I was probably a little bit more political than other people on the campaign, on the First Lady's office, and I was what are we doing this for? Who cares? I literally, sort of flippantly, and it was late at night. It's okay, just my excuse. But I was what are we doing this work on folic acid? And Hillary looked at me and said, because it matters to the babies. And I was okay, sorry. And actually years later I had my two kids, and I remember being oh, folic acid really matters. And she's I told you so! In a nice way. And so, what I have, I truly mean this, the reason why public service matters so much is because it is the way you affect the most people. I am proudest. Healthcare, again, going out, trudging up to the Congress every day and trying to solve probably, pretty deep policy problems with how to get the ACA to work the best, et cetera. And we didn't solve all of them. But, to me, there are parts of the ACA I can look at today and that I worked on and figured out, and that is the greatest privilege of my life, which is I was able to do something that helped a lot of people. And I think that's what public service is about, and I think the best people go into public service for that reason. And honestly, we've had some really not so great presidents. I won't say anything about who and when, But we've also had people who, despite how difficult it is to do things, keep trying. And that is sort of the lesson I've learned looking at people, which is like there's just a lot to persistence, and like when you get pushed down, to get back up and keep trying. And resilience. You know, there's just a lot to resilience in leadership, and a history is filled with stories of people who were completely counted out and who came back to actually make a difference in people's lives and who've done really phenomenal things. And so those are sort of the lessons I've taken, and you know, I'm active on Twitter and people yell at me on occasion, and you know, I think that like, you know, we live in confrontational times, but if you actually focus on trying to, like, what's really important, you see that people are still there doing it.
That's such great advice. Let me go to the gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Aaron Kershaw. I just had a question that yesterday the Center of American Progress released a new report proposing that there be a one-time FAFSA. You know,
I'm sorry?
A one-time FAFSA.
A one-time FAFSA. And you know, so students who just have to enroll once when they are first enrolling in school.
Yeah.
How much of an uphill battle do you think that is? You know, trying to make it a little bit easier for students where they don't have to, you know, fill out an annual form.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interest in this issue. I think I'm hoping that we can move it in a Democratic House. You know, I mean, to be honest, I think that, and you know, not being partisan, I'm trying to say this in a nonpartisan way, is the current U.S. Department of Education has been less student-friendly than some previous administrations. But I think one of the things that's important about, I mean, we should recognize, like, you know, it was a big turnout. Democrats took the House, Republicans still have the Senate. I think there are a lot of issues like this that can maybe move in one chamber, builds more and more support for them, and then possibly in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years be able to move. So I think there's a lot of interest, and I'm hoping we will be pushing it really hard. There are a lot of allies on the Hill who are interested in it. And I think the way we should think about FAFSA and all these other issues is, instead of thinking about the forms as a way to restrict people, how do we think of these forms as a way to empower people? Because we actually have an investment. As I said, a principle is we want more and more people to have access to college, right? So how do we do that? And changing the form is one way.
One day I have to tell you my FAFSA story.
I think we all have them.
Yeah,
right.
But what I love about the question, and what many people don't recognize is, and your comment responded to this, is that FAFSA is oftentimes the biggest barrier for first generation new students who have no idea about navigating the complexity of the educational experience, let alone having to have substantive and oftentimes difficult conversation with parents about why you need to know what you made last year. Yeah. That to me is, and as someone who had to have that very hard conversation with my father, it was, to this day, is indelibly in my mind about why we have to have some conversation about reforming FAFSA for all the reasons that you asked and for other ones.
You talked about reducing tuition and almost, making it affordable for many college students. And I think it's a great idea, although part of me as a former faculty member thinks that there's sometimes some value to having skin in the game.
Yeah, I mean, we think you should have skin in the game.
But all of these ideas, universal health care, they're all great ideas. My question, and maybe it's too in the weeds at this point, but how do you pay for this?
Yeah,
There's so many big priorities in the country right now, and these are all expensive things. So the question is, how do you realistically pay for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about politics or the political system is that it has managed to pay for things it wants to pay for, right? So we went through a big debate about tax cuts a year ago, and we somehow, I mean, just to tell everyone the last 20 years, in a nutshell, we had a Democratic president in 2000, the president I worked for, have a budget surplus. Then we had this whole discussion about how we have to pay for everything, except when George Bush came into power, we had a prescription drug bill that wasn't paid for. Then Obama comes into office, we have a massive crisis, and within 2 years of that massive crisis, when in 2010 and 2011, when unemployment was 7.5% in this country, everyone was focused on deficit reduction around in Washington. And it's not that that's crazy, but then we have a Republican president, and the first and most important thing to do is a massive tax cut, which at the very least, from every analysis, will exacerbate inequality. That tax cut adds $1.6 trillion to the deficit. There's no fiscal stimulus argument for that tax cut because unemployment at the time was 4%. So I think the challenge we have is not how we pay for things, although I recognize we should pay for them, but what we choose to pay for. And so my perspective on this is, just to say, you could radically increase the affordability of college in the United States today at a fraction of what we just spent on a massive tax cut to the wealthiest people in the country, as well as corporations. And I would just remind everyone that we did give this massive tax cut to corporations. Everyone told us it would be passed on to employees, and GM just took the tax cut and shut down 4 plants in Ohio. So I think the issue is we actually need to think through what gets the economy and economic growth that we need over the long term. And to me, that's an investment in human capital and physical capital. You have to invest in your people in order to grow your economy. And that's how I think we should look at, if you actually do an economic analysis, every dollar a state invests in its education system comes back $2, $3, $4, $5. And that's why states have done it, and that's why it's important that we do it as a country. And to be specific about our plan, you could, if you took away the tax cut, you'd still have plenty of money left over to pay for other things or to do deficit reduction.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. A lot of questions are coming to my mind, but I'm going to choose two quickly. I know you're going to talk about DACA, and I'm going to leave that question for you. But one of the things that is right now challenging me and going out is in terms of the sense of 2020 and the issue of the immigration and the citizenship questions. And I know in 3 weeks, perhaps we're going to know what the resolution will be. That's one. And the other question is about civic.
You mean citizenship on the census?
On the census, the question. And also what the census in details means. What is important for us to, so people sometimes don't make the connection.
Yeah.
So I would like for you to elaborate a little bit about that and what will be the impact. The other question is about civic engagement. We're in a college institution. How much civic engagement we need to encourage our student body to get involved, and why is that important?
Those are two great questions. Thank you. So just I'll try and do the census issue in a relatively short order. So every 10 years, the federal government conducts a census. The census allocates the determination of the census. So they do, the census literally is basically scoping out the full country. And the census determines funding levels for education, poverty programs, the safety net in general, how that money is allocated. The problem we have with the current administration is that they've introduced a citizenship question, which a lot of people are going to feel uncomfortable answering. The census, much of the safety net is not determined on citizenship, it's determined on poverty rates and other issues. And so the census is not supposed to be just for citizens, it's supposed to be for residents. But the Trump administration introduced the citizenship question. It has turned out that Jeff Sessions and Steve Bannon were the architects of introducing this question. A lot of groups, including the Center for American Progress, but other civil rights groups as well, have focused on this. There is a debate in the Congress as part of the appropriations process to strip the question out. Democrats and Republicans are negotiating on this issue right now. It is one of those technical issues that really has incredible reverberations across, whether Maryland or Missouri will get like a right amounts of money depending on the number of people. So it is a really important issue. And then your other question was, and we're engaged on that, is civic engagement. So one of the things that in my kind of fantasy world of how the universe should operate would be that schools should actually publish their voting data, like how many students vote, and not only who are registered, but who they vote. Some schools do this. In fact, a lot of Midwestern, one of the reasons why there was so much surge in voting is that a bunch of the Big Ten states and Big Ten colleges and universities in the Midwest had a competition of who would have the highest voting participation between like Ohio and Michigan, and so Michigan actually won. But it is something to think about for every college because it is important. It's not obviously just important for people to vote, but what I say to everyone is that decisions are being made with or without you, right?
Yep.
If you choose not to vote, people are making decisions to affect your life. You're just choosing not to be part of that. It's not like that there's some decision like if you don't participate, they're not going to do anything, right? And so I know that we might get to Dreamers and DACA, but
You can go right in. Go ahead.
that's one of the issues, which is a lot of what's happened on immigration reform and DACA and other issues is because there are politicians who think Latinos don't vote, right? They don't vote at the same, they have not voted at the same level, they're not in their districts, they're not in their state, and that's why we've had some of the challenges we've had. But I hope actually, I hope and actually expect that the new Democratic House of Representatives will pass a Dreamers fix, and then it really will be up to Trump to put his rhetoric where his mouth is, or put his actions where his words are, and fix the problem or not. I mean, it's not like he's been a great problem solver on immigration issues so far, but hope springs eternal, I guess.
Yeah.
So,
Please.
All right, so Neera, Dr. Pollard, it's great to see both of you. Thank you for being here. I have a question to ask you. Since there's a lot of students has been struggling with like college student loans, and as well as for some tuitions in university. I have to pay like nearly $2,000 or $3,000 for tuitions, and I probably had to tell you that the community college is expected to be free, probably like later on or in the future. We just want to know. And we also want to know that there's a lot of students who are concerned since DACA has been repealed. We just want to know that how could students were able to do in order to reduce the tuition so that the family will not have to get any concerns about that stuff. Thank you.
yeah. No, those are great questions. And I think, I guess I would say two things, which is we talked a lot about student tuition, which affects students coming in. There is a similar discussion about the student debt issues. So how to lower the debt or make, there's obviously programs that are income-based repayments so that you could it's a small share of your earnings, that it wouldn't be a bar. And actually there are a lot of ideas of just reducing the debt level and having a partial, kind of federal, state, and individual program where you essentially buy out a little bit of the debt. We do have a big problem in the country. Again, we talked a lot about tuition. Student debt in the United States is like over $1 trillion, right? That's like lots of people with a lot of debt. And student debt makes it harder for people to buy houses. Student debt makes it harder for people to build equity over their lives. So it is a problem we have to address. I would say on DACA and Dreamers right now, the issue really is, right now, just to say this, a federal court has stayed any changes to DACA, so people should be still protected, but that could go away, and that's why it's urgent that we pass legislation.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I wanted to address particularly the issue of public dialogue and the media in particular. It's been said Americans love underdogs and hate losers. And you focused in your biography, you focused on how behind the scenes people are working on the issues for the common good. But to see the way the campaign was conducted in 2016, you would never know that we have a government for our mutual benefit and for good. And I was wondering what you saw in terms of the future, in terms of influencing public opinion and dialogue, because people won't, a lot of Americans don't actually know how the government works or how things affect them. And it's easy to become passive and disengaged. And I'm particularly interested in how you see the role of the media informing this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I have to just basically confess I don't have a great answer. I mean, I think a deep challenge is that our news system is infotainment. It's not, I mean, our news, and really I think we have to recognize that that's a feedback loop with audiences. And so, I mean, I think one of the big problems in media is that, again, I go on cable news and I see it myself. What gets ratings is conflict. What, reporters, I mean, this is a perfect example. We went through the entire Affordable Care Act debate over a year and almost a half. And at the end of that debate, like 60% of Americans could remember the Cornhusker deal that was this like one late night deal to get Senator Nelson's vote, which was actually at the end taken out of the deal, so it was not even in the law. But people could remember that, but they could not. They did not know the basic formula of the bill, and it was like, I really think it was so much easier. It's so much easier for reporters to cover food fights and personality conflicts. And in that way, like Trump is like almost like a perfect media experiment, right? Because everything is a food fight. Everything is a battle. Everything is some fight he's picked with some random person. And there's not that much focus on policy. And, it's just completely out of whack. The government makes decisions that affect people's lives every day. And the policy debate is not part of the discussion. And in 2016, there was 700 times more stories about Hillary's emails than actually anything she was planning to do as president for a policy debate. And so, I mean, I'm certainly not one to join in a kind of Trumpian attack on the media, but we do have real problems in that we don't have a system in which people are looking at politics as a way to affect their lives, because the way reporters cover or the media covers things is essentially a kind of culture, like it's sort of as entertainment to people instead of policy impact on people.
I think the other issue with that too, and we were just talking about this earlier this evening, to me there's a lack of a distinction between news and commentary. So,
yeah.
And you look at the proliferation of, any number of, ABC, not literally ABC, but, news stations that have, 3-letter names, they all seem to have placed a very small window on the news, but they can have hours of commentary. And what we, I think, as Americans have become, we've replaced the idea of Ted Koppel in the news with any number of commentators who speak from the positionality that we bring to it. So,
yeah.
And as a result of that, we aren't able to distinguish, I think, oftentimes between what is news, what is fact, what is fiction, and then the media and this broad umbrella becomes infotainment. So let's see who's going to get the best word in, who's going to have the best 30-second soundbite, who's going to, 4 or 5 people walked in here and I said, I saw Neera on TV last night. But that to me is very powerful because it gives you a platform, but to me, this type of conversation of hearing your in-depth answers to something is very different than what you may be able to get in a 5 or 7 minute piece if you're even there that long.
Yeah, well, if it's hardball, you're lucky to get a few words in edgewise.
Yeah.
But, yeah, no, I think this is a central problem, which is even in newspapers, a lot of stories are news analysis versus actual news. And I think a big problem is it makes it hard for people to recognize what's actually happening versus what people's opinions are happening. And like I go through this all the time, which is there are definitely shows which are all like basically a food fight battle between two opposing sides, and it's a question whether you participate or not, but then you like recognize they're influential and they do influence the public debate, and it's important to get an alternative viewpoint out there. So I think one of the deeper challenges we have right now, which even goes beyond that, is that we're not having even debates about opinion anymore, but debates about facts, right? So, we have a huge climate analysis done by the Trump administration saying the incredible consequences of inaction on climate, and that's like the whole people on TV will be like, that didn't really happen, or there are times I go on TV and I literally think I've lost my mind because everyone is acting like, you'll talk to someone and they'll just act like like up is down, night is day, and it's like, it is a little scary, the cult like talking points people will like just feel free to have. So
thank you.
Not a note of optimism there, unfortunately.
I'm going to give you a chance to flip to optimism. So you made a point, to paraphrase, about radical inclusion is seeing someone in their distant experience. And so I try to do that with my work. And so I'd love some tips on how to get people to see that and to experience the distant experience, because it is so far for them, they can't get there. So if you have some tips, I'd love them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I really do think that people, a hard thing in policymaking, well, to step back, my experience in policy is really people's experience so much determine the kind of decisions they make, right? That's not to say you can't have like a feminist male leader do policies that are good for women. But it is to say that at every table I've been part of, having a lot of women has meant that we have policy solutions that actually include women more. Having more people of color actually means that you have policies that are inclusive. Now, we should recognize lots of important progress has been made by people who do not have the lived experience, but it is my experience that policy is always better when it does that. And I don't really think that there is a substitute for trying to have that experience. So, we've done a lot of work at CAP on how to create economic growth and communities left behind by economic growth over the last 20 years. Those communities are pockets of urban communities, but there are a lot of rural communities. And I don't, for us, it's important for us to actually go out to those places. So we've been to we've had community meetings in the Mississippi Delta. We've had community meetings in rural Arizona and rural Ohio and, Youngstown and, places like that. And I just don't, I really don't have a shortcut, right? I just think to engage with people, to understand how to be in someone else's shoes, you have to at least engage those people. And one of the problems we have as a society is that we are polarizing, right? So the biggest actually indicator of political outlook in the United States is density of where you live, right? So if you live in a city, whether you're white, black, Latino, Asian, college or non-college, you're more likely to be progressive or open-minded about race and other things. If you live in a rural community, sparse population place, you're much more likely to be conservative. And I think it is part of the thing of you have to experience these things in life to sort of see a world. Because I think an issue of human nature, and it's depressing, but an issue of human nature is when you don't know something, it's easy to fill the void with bad things than good things, right? And a lot of our politics today again, I will try not to be partisan, but a lot of politics today is about filling people who don't know about something or have an experience with it, like with a sense of fear. So I'm just going to analytically describe the fact that we had like a 2-week discussion right before the midterms about caravans in places like the caravan going through Mexico, in places like North Dakota, Missouri, and Indiana, which are 1,000 miles away from the border, right? No one's coming from the caravan and going to North Dakota. Okay, that's just not happening, right? But like the caravan is dominating the news. People are running ads on the caravan. That's an example of, if people don't know something, they fill with fear, right? So I don't have a good answer. I just think that for us, I say to my teams, we have to care about people who have completely different experiences, people who are hurting, like they matter whether they're in Appalachia or Detroit. Like we should care about people who are suffering in this economy or who have challenges wherever they are. And that's important for progressives and conservatives. Like it's not just all on them. We have to care about it too, because at the end of the day, the central question in America right now is, will a politics that sees everything as a zero sum, that pits one group against another, that sees a kind of divisive debate of who America is for, is that the politics we're going to have for the rest of our lives? Or is it going to be a politics where we try and solve each other's problems? And that is a central question that is roiling our politics. And if we want to have the latter be our answer, then I say for myself, as a progressive, I have to understand the lived experience of people who live very differently from me and see why they are suffering as well.
So unfortunately, we have to pause, and I apologize for that. But I think this
It's my
has been
fault.
it's okay. No, it's been a robust conversation, and I hope that if you don't already follow the Center for American Progress, the work that Neera is doing there, I really would encourage you to do so. I think it is some of the most critical dialogues that we need to be having right now in our country are being led by this think tank. So I really want to thank Neera for being here this evening.
Thank you so much.
I know you fit us in the midst of some things.
Thank you so much.
I also want to thank just a few other people before I let us out. I want to thank Bethesda Magazine, who has been a wonderful supporter of this program in terms of media. And also, we would like to thank the Meyer Foundation. I don't know if I saw Nikki come in or not. Is she? Where is Nikki? Oh, there you go,
thank
Nikki.
you.
I really want to thank the Meyer Foundation for their generous support of these civil dialogues, understanding what our vision was and why we were wanting to do this, so thank you for that. I also would be remiss, I get to walk in and waltz in, and those of you who work at the college know that I'm on sabbatical this semester, but I intentionally get to do these, and I'm very excited. But I get to waltz in like I did a whole lot of work, and I didn't, because I have such a wonderful team. So let me call out MCTV, who always are diligent, on time, doing hard work. I'm very grateful to you all. I want to thank the Rockville campus for hosting us and our student advisory council members who are here, and among all the other students who chose to be here. Our special events team, Denise, I don't know where she is absolutely fabulous, and they make things flow so smoothly, getting us in and out. And finally, Dr. Megan Gibbons from my office, who is outstanding at giving not only words and ideas, but takes a good idea and makes it better. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here this evening. Look forward to the next one of these that we'll be doing in the early spring semester, and have a wonderful rest of your semester. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was